For 60 years, they were locked away in a filing cabinet in Columbia University's medical archives. Dr. Bela Mittelmann's therapy notes with his most famous patient. No one knew about them until the day a doctoral researcher opened that cabinet in 2015. The first page of the notes bore a date, December 14th, 1948. Patient name, Marlon Brando Jr. Age, 24. Complaint: I can't distinguish between reality and fantasy. Brando had not yet become a star on Broadway at that time. It was 3 years before he took on the role of Stanley Kowalski. So the problem began before method acting. Or perhaps method acting discovered Brando's already existing psychological fragility and turned it into a weapon. The records of the next 7 years proved this. After every major role, Kowalski, Terry Malloy, Mark Antony, Brando sank deeper into darkness. One sentence kept recurring in the doctor's notes. The patient experiences a fear of losing his identity, yet sees this as the source of his success. Method acting made Brando the world's greatest actor, but it also destroyed him. Dr. Bela Mittelmann noticed the young man's hands trembling as he sat across from him in his Manhattan office. Marlon Brando was 24 years old, a student of Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio, and was slowly making a name for himself in the New York theatre world. But when he arrived at the office that morning, he didn't look like a young man on the path to fame. He looked like a broken man. Mittelmann's notes from that first session were surprisingly detailed. Brando could barely speak when he arrived. After 15 minutes of silence, when the first words came out of his mouth, the doctor wrote down those sentences word for word. Sometimes I forget who I am, not just on stage, but in everyday life. When I look in the mirror, I don't know if that man is me. At first, Mittelmann thought this was just the exaggerated emotionality of a young actor, but in subsequent sessions, he realized Brando was serious. He was truly experiencing this. Brando's childhood was traumatic. His father, Marlon Brando Sr., was an alcoholic and violent salesman. His mother, Dorothy, was an amateur actress in Omaha who neglected her son because she was overwhelmed by her own disappointments. Growing up, Brando witnessed his parents' fights, heard his father yell at his mother, and lived in a home where he felt like a mistake. When he came to the Actors Studio, Lee Strasberg taught him something. Don't hide the pain, use it. That was the basis of method acting. The system developed by Stanislavski in Moscow and adapted by Strasberg for American theatre required actors to relive their own emotional memories on stage. If your character was sad, you would find a sad memory from your own life and feel that emotion again. If your character was angry, you would summon your own anger. This technique changed acting, but for Brando, it opened a door, and behind that door lay darkness. Mittelmann began to worry as he analyzed Brando's relationship with method acting, because Brando was using the technique wrong, or maybe he was using it too well. He repeated the same complaint in every session. When playing a character on stage, becoming that character came so easily that returning to his own self was painful. Being Marlon Brando in everyday life was boring, empty, and meaningless. But being someone else on stage, free, powerful, and alive. The doctor considered this to be early signs of dissociative identity disorder, but did not yet make a diagnosis. Instead, he asked Brando a question. If you prefer being someone else so much over being yourself, who is the real Marlon? Brando couldn't answer that question, because he didn't know. In December 1947, Marlon Brando took on the role of Stanley Kowalski in Tennessee Williams's play, A Streetcar Named Desire. Director Elia Kazan saw the savagery within Brando and let him loose on stage. During rehearsals, Brando immersed himself so deeply into Stanley's world that he never left the character, even backstage. His friends noticed the change. The gentle, shy Marlon was gone. In his place was a rough, aggressive, almost dangerous man. When the play premiered, the New York theatre world was shocked. Audiences held their breath watching Brando's performance. That torn t-shirt, that animalistic energy, that stellar scream. Brando wasn't just playing Stanley Kowalski. He was Stanley Kowalski. But no one saw what happened after the curtain fell. Brando went to the dressing room, looked in the mirror, and saw a face he didn't recognize. Then he ran to the bathroom and vomited. This didn't happen just once. For 8 weeks, the same ritual repeated after every show. Brando would go on stage, become Stanley, receive applause, then collapse backstage. When he told Dr. Mittelmann what was happening during this period, his voice trembled. Stanley is stronger than me. I play him, but he controls me. When I go home at night, I think like him. I talk like him. I can't hear my own thoughts anymore. Even more frightening was that Brando began to exhibit Stanley's traits in his personal life. One evening, while sitting with friends at a bar, he attacked a man next to him for no reason. His friends had to pull him away, and when they asked, "Why did you do that?" Brando looked at them in bewilderment. He didn't remember. Or he didn't want to remember. Another night, when his ex-girlfriend called, Brando yelled at her in Stanley's tone of voice, cursed at her, and slammed the phone down. The next day, he called the woman and apologized tearfully. "It wasn't me. It was something inside me. I can't control it." But the woman didn't forgive him. Because that voice was Brando's voice. Those words came out of Brando's mouth. Stanley couldn't be an excuse. When Mittelmann heard this statement, alarm bells rang. Because what Brando was describing was not simple acting. It was psychological fusion. The doctor wrote in his notes, "MB's level of identification with the character has reached dangerous levels. He is showing signs of post-performance dissociation. He is struggling to return to his own identity. If this continues, there could be permanent damage." But Brando didn't stop. He couldn't stop, because critics were declaring him the greatest actor in the world. Broadway tickets were selling out months in advance. Hollywood was after him. And for the first time in his life, Brando felt he was truly good at something. The only price was his own soul. The method acting taught by Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio seemed simple on the surface. You would do emotional memory exercises. You would choose a memory from your past and recall every detail of that moment. Smell, sound, touch, taste. Then you would relive that emotion in the present. If your character was crying over the death of his mother, you would recall your own loss and shed real tears. This technique revolutionized acting because performances became real, no longer artificial. But Strasberg forgot to tell his students one thing. Once you open that door, it can be very difficult to close it. Brando took method acting to the extreme. When preparing for a role, he would start living the character's life months in advance. For Stanley Kowalski, he roamed the working-class neighborhoods of New Orleans, hung out with factory workers, learned their way of speaking, their walk, their movements. Then he became those people, not just on stage, but in his private life too. He talked like Stanley, sat like Stanley, thought like Stanley when dining with friends. According to Dr. Mittelmann's records, Brando once confessed, "Yesterday, I yelled at a woman on the street, for no reason. I just thought Stanley would do that, so I did it. Then I went home and cried, because I'm not that kind of person. Or am I? Now, I'm not sure." At this point, Mittelmann made a suggestion to Brando. Maybe method acting isn't right for you. Maybe you should try more traditional techniques. But Brando refused. Because when he took the stage using traditional techniques, his performance was ordinary. The audience didn't applaud. The critics didn't write about it. But when he used the method, he became brilliant. Even if it caused him pain, he couldn't give it up. Success had become an addiction. And method acting was his heroin. Other actors training at the actors' studio at the same time were experiencing similar problems, but none of them went as deep as Brando. James Dean, Montgomery Clift, Paul Newman, they all used the method, but they could all draw a line. Brando couldn't, or didn't want to. Strasberg noticed this, and specifically kept Brando at the studio to talk to him. No one knows exactly what they discussed, but after that conversation, Brando didn't come to the studio for 3 days. When he returned, his eyes were red, and he said nothing. He just continued with the exercises, even harder, even more ruthlessly. After Streetcar, Brando's career skyrocketed. In 1951 came Viva Zapata, in 1953 Julius Caesar, and in 1954, On the Waterfront. For each role, Brando repeated the same process. He immersed himself completely, became one with the character, lost himself. But each time, the return was harder. A note from Dr. Mittelmann in 1953 was particularly alarming. MB spoke as Mark Antony in today's session. When I said I wanted to talk to Marlon, he asked, "Who is Marlon?" I thought he was joking, but his eyes were serious. He really didn't know. During the filming of On the Waterfront, Brando spent weeks in the port areas of New Jersey to live as the character Terry Malloy. He worked alongside the dock workers, drank in their bars, and got into their fights. Director Elia Kazan wrote in his diary, "Marlon isn't acting anymore. He really is Terry, even when the cameras are off. One day on my set, he asked for someone else's cigarette and said, 'If you don't give it to me, I'll beat you up.' It wasn't a joke. He really would have beaten him up. We spent hours calming him down." Kazan and Brando's relationship was complicated. Kazan knew Brando was a genius, but he also saw that he was destroying himself. One day during filming, Kazan found Brando crying on set. When he asked, "What's wrong?" Brando didn't answer. He just kept crying. Kazan never forgot that moment, and years later said in an interview, "Marlon wasn't crying for Terry that day. He was crying for himself, for the Marlon he had lost." The film's most famous scene, the one in the back seat of the taxi where he tells his brother, "I could have been a contender," was shot in one take. Because Brando wasn't Terry at that moment. Brando was crying for his own life, his own regrets. Kazan didn't stop the camera because he knew this was pure pain. It wasn't acting, it was real. And that scene won Brando an Oscar. But the same scene distanced him a little more from himself. The most striking part of Mittelmann's recordings is an incident Brando recounted in 1954. 2 weeks after filming On the Waterfront wrapped, Brando was alone at home one night. He looked in the mirror and saw a face he didn't recognize. Panicked, He sat down in front of the mirror and began to speak aloud. I am Marlon Brando. I was born in 1924. My mother is Dorothy. My father is Marlon Sr. But the words sounded foreign. It was as if he were reading someone else's life. Then he noticed something. He could hear his own voice in the mirror, but in his thoughts, it was Terry Malloy's voice. Terry's sentences were running through his mind. Terry's memories were coming back to life. But Terry wasn't real. So where were these memories coming from? That night, Brando urgently called his doctor. Mittelmann immediately summoned him to his office, and they talked until morning. Brando was crying, trembling, and constantly repeating, "I'm disappearing. Find me." After that night, the doctor came to a serious conclusion. If Brando didn't give up method acting, he could suffer permanent psychological damage. Perhaps he already had, but Brando couldn't give it up. Because the next day was the premiere of On the Waterfront, and that performance would win him an Oscar. The world would declare him a genius. But was losing yourself worth the world's applause? Brando had a clear answer to that question. Yes. In 1955, Brando stopped coming to Dr. Mittelmann. Their 7-year therapeutic relationship ended, and the doctor did not record the reason why. But the note from the session before the last one read, "MB no longer wants help. He has accepted it." In his own words, "Marlon is dead. Only the characters live, and I'm at peace with that." This sentence was the most disturbing of all Mittelmann's notes, because Brando had given up. He was no longer trying to regain his identity. Instead, he had chosen to live like a faceless ghost. Each new role was a new mask, a new escape. After Brando's last session, Mittelmann consulted with his colleagues. Maybe they could do something. Maybe he should be hospitalized. But Brando was not legally dangerous. He wasn't harming himself or others. He was just disappearing, and there was no cure for that. The doctor noted in his records. Perfection in art and mental health can sometimes be conflicting goals. In MB's case, artistry won, humanity lost. I'm not sure if this is a success or a tragedy. In the years that followed, Brando's performances grew even stronger, but his personal life collapsed. His relationships failed, because when women fell in love with him, they didn't know which Marlon they were in love with. Stanley, Terry, or a Marlon who didn't even exist. Brando himself didn't know. He was cold and distant in interviews because there was no himself left. He only came alive when the cameras rolled. And each time he came alive, it meant a little more death. In the 1960s, Brando became increasingly rebellious. He began to openly say that he hated the Hollywood system. But perhaps what he really hated was himself, or rather, not being himself. He fled to Tahiti, bought an island, and distanced himself from civilization. But the characters found him there too, because they were inside him, not outside. When Dr. Bela Mittelmann died in 1979, he donated all his patient records to Columbia University. For decades, those files were forgotten in locked cabinets. Until 2015, when a young psychiatry researcher decided to examine Mittelmann's archives for his doctoral thesis. When he opened the cabinet and saw the thick file labeled Brando Marlon Jr., his breath caught. 7 years of therapy records were there. Every session was meticulously documented, every crisis detailed. And they all proved one thing. Method acting had made Marlon Brando the greatest actor in the world, but it had also destroyed him. When these records were published, The theatre and film worlds were shaken. Because everyone saw Brando as a genius, but no one knew his pain. The dark side of method acting had finally been revealed. Today, Strasberg's techniques are still taught at the actor's studio. Young actors still do emotional memory exercises. But now there's a warning. If you go too deep, you may not be able to come back. Marlon Brando learned this, and the price was his own identity. After Mittelmann's recordings were released, it emerged that other famous actors had similar experiences. Heath Ledger went so deep into his role as the Joker that he couldn't come back and died of an overdose. Daniel Day-Lewis couldn't return to his own identity for a year after playing Lincoln and quit acting. Joaquin Phoenix had to undergo therapy for months after Joker. Method acting was still Hollywood's most respected technique, but it was also the most dangerous. Because to achieve the best performances, you had to sell your soul. Brando's story has taken on new meaning today. We live in a more mentally health-conscious era and now understand destroying yourself for art was not heroism. It was tragedy. Brando left the world with magnificent performances. Stanley Kowalski, Terry Malloy, Vito Corleone. But what did he give in return? Everything. Who he was, what he felt, his own reality. And in the end, he died as a man lost among characters, without an identity. Dr. Mittelmann's final note from 1955 still holds true. In MB's case, art won, humanity lost. And perhaps the most painful question was it worth it?